Good afternoon. Thanks so much for being with us. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., welcome you to tonight's America at a Crossroads virtual town hall program. Thanks to our leadership team, and a special welcome tonight to the exceptional Bret Stephens and Warren Olney for joining us for what is sure to be an interesting conversation on a wide range of topics. Next week, before our 2-week Passover break on Tuesday, and please remember, next week is Tuesday instead of Wednesday, we'll welcome the brilliant Anne Applebaum, whose depth of understanding of geopolitics with an emphasis on Europe and the Russia-Ukraine war is remarkable. Anne will be in conversation with frequent America at a Crossroads host Madeline Brand on the topic, War in Europe, What Does It Portend? Because of the first 2 Wednesdays of April, which are both Passover holidays, our next program after Anne Applebaum will be after Passover. We will be hosting the former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, who will be in conversation with Warren Olney again on the topic, War in Europe, Is There a Winning Formula? I want to remind you all that we cannot control the sound from our end. From our end, it's all working. If it's not working from your end, adjust your sound. And also you have a closed captioning button on the bottom of your Zoom dashboard there. So you can put on closed captioning and be able to read what you can't hear. I also want to remind you that when you're registering for our programs on Eventbrite, don't uncheck the boxes or you will not be on our list to get the Zoom links. I get literally hundreds of emails from people who claim they don't get the Zoom link. Of course, the other hundreds of emails I get from people who say I sent it too many times. But for those of you who aren't getting it, it's because you're unchecking boxes. But if you just email me, I will, you know that you'll get it because it's on auto on my computer. You get anybody who sends an email gets the Zoom link the day of or the day before the program. And if you're having any trouble registering, send me an email. I'll be happy to register you. I know there have been some kinks with Eventbrite lately. We have no control over Eventbrite. But if you can't register, just send me an email and I'll register you from the back end here. Of course, as always, thanks for joining us. And now my colleague and friend David Lehr will make a couple of additional announcements.
Thank you, Janice. Welcome once again to America at Crossroads. I'm really looking forward to tonight's conversation with Bret Stephens. He's always a fascinating interview, straightforward, analytical, undogmatic, and thought-provoking. A perfect match for our America at Crossroads audience, which tonight is at 4,000 plus. Since Bret first spoke for us nearly 6 years ago in person in the pre-COVID era, he has always enlightened and informed us. After the program that Janet described with Admiral Mullen, we'll try to get a handle on artificial intelligence with Bret's colleague at the New York Times, Shira Franco. She's the paper's San Francisco-based technology maven. That'll be on April 26th. The following week, May 3rd, we'll focus on another constellation of complex issues, economic sanctions, boycotts, and economic warfare. Do they work? These topics are of great significance in light of our policy vis-a-vis Russia, Iran, and North Korea, much in the headlines these days. We'll have Adam Smith, who heads the sanctions section of the law firm of Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, and he formerly worked on sanctions in the Obama administration, and Professor Nick Mulder of Cornell University, and they'll debate the issue on May 3rd. Our moderator tonight is the indefatigable Warren Olney. He's our most frequent host who has spent decades interviewing thousands of guests on commercial TV, public television, and public radio. He's won over 40 awards for the quality of his work, including Journalist of the Year bestowed by his peers. He's been a fixture on Southern California's news scene for decades. Warren?
David, thank you so much. It's nice to be here once again, and I am delighted to have the privilege of introducing Bret Stephens for another return appearance on America at a Crossroads. He's been here a lot of times. He is a Pulitzer Prize winner for commentary, and that was in 2014. He's been a columnist and opinion editor for the Wall Street Journal. He is now a columnist for the New York Times, and of course, a contributor to NBC News and MSNBC as well. He's author of a book called America in Retreat. He's also a self-described neocon who is a confirmed never-Trumper. And Bret Stephens, welcome. It's great to have a chance to talk with you.
It's nice to be with you, Warren. It's an honor to be interviewed.
I want to also welcome the audience. It's great to have you with us. And as I think was mentioned before, if you go to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, you can write out a question. David Lehr will then send the question to me, As we get toward the end of the program, I'll ask as many of your questions as I possibly can. So, Bret, from 2002 to 2004, you were editor of the Jerusalem Post, and you're now editor of Sapir, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, a journal of Jewish conversation. So I want to start with the current crisis over Mr. Netanyahu's latest regime in Israel. There have been massive street protests almost since the first of the year. President Herzog last week said that there is a warning, he gave a warning of civil war. He said the abyss is within touching distances. Others have called it an existential crisis. Are those exaggerations?
Well, I very much hope that Israel will find its way toward a productive, workable compromise. If you look at the history of Israel, which is now approaching its 75th birthday, Warren, there have been similar kinds of crises from the very beginning over the Altalena ship and right-wing militias that challenged the authority of David Ben-Gurion's state over German reparations from Germany in the early 50s. I came of age during the Oslo period, which of course led to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin by a right-wing Jewish fanatic. Similar problems over Israel's withdrawal from Gaza. So Israel has been in this place before, but the intensity, the duration of the protests feels different this time. And so I think President Herzog's warning should be heeded seriously. If anyone, I'm sure people of the several thousand people watching our program, people who know their history of ancient Israel know that the ancient Jewish state tore itself to pieces and repeatedly had civil wars. Fratricidal conflict is part of Jewish history, and Israel has to be careful that it doesn't repeat that history. The issue here, I don't think, is really about the necessity or the need for some kind of judicial reform. There is a perfectly good argument to make that Israel, among the world's democracies, has a uniquely and probably overly powerful judiciary, which meddles in aspects of democratic life which would be inconceivable in other parliamentary systems, and certainly here in the United States. The question here is why this is being done now. What is the real motive for reform that no one was particularly asking for before the last election, and who stands to benefit most from it? And that, I think, is what's really animating Israelis. If this were just a dry question about somewhat rebalancing the power of the judiciary, you wouldn't see so many people in the streets. But there is a real perception in Israel, which I share, that this is a power grab, an effort of a kind of a power grab by not just Netanyahu, but the people on the rightward flank of his coalition. And he leads one of the most rightward coalitions in Israeli history, if not the most, to consolidate some of their prerogatives and privileges in Israeli society. In my view, most outrageously, the exemption of ultra-Orthodox from military service, which is otherwise an obligation of Israeli life, and which the Supreme Court has repeatedly attempted to diminish, if not eliminate. So things here are at stake that go beyond judicial reform. Is it going to be a civil war? I don't think so. I think countries that stare into the abyss tend to draw back from them. But we know from not just the history of ancient Israel, but other countries, that sometimes they walk right into them. And I hope that's not what is going to happen now.
One of those who talked about an existential crisis was Rabbi Farkas of the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles, who visited Israel last week and came back using that phrase. Israel is important to American Jews, and they're important to Israel. To what extent is that relationship now being eroded?
I think quite seriously. And again, you can look to the past and say, well, it's been frayed before. My memory even stretches back to the aftermath of the Lebanon War, Sabra and Shatila, and very different feelings among American Jews following the war. But I think this is different because this is not about Israel's security. It's about Israel's democracy. And I think here, American Jews really do have important things to say, to contribute. I've always made the case that when it comes to security, the American Jewish community should at least approach the issue with a certain amount of humility. It's not our children whose lives are on the line on some of these security questions. But on the question of Israel as a liberal democracy, and I want to stress the word liberal democracy, we should be concerned, because the problem here isn't, it's misnamed as a problem about democracy. If this reform is to pass, Israel in some sense will be more democratic because the Knesset will be more powerful. The subject here is about a different kind of democracy. It's about liberalism in the classic sense of the word, or to use another word, it's about freedom. Are there institutions inside of Israel that can counteract the power of the majority, that can defend the rights of minorities within Israel and individuals within Israel? And I think that's a subject that really ought to animate us. After all, American Jews have been making the case for decades that we should support Israel thick or thin because it's the only democracy, it's the only free country in the Middle East, and it needs to remain that way if it's still going to command widespread Jewish American support, or widespread American support for that matter.
Members of Congress, almost 100 of them, both Jewish and non-Jewish, have called upon President Biden to, and this is their phrase, use all diplomatic tools available to prevent what they see as further damage. What has he done, and what are these diplomatic tools that are available to him?
Well, I think actually President Biden has played his cards very well. The diplomatic tool that was available to him was making a statement by way of my esteemed colleague Tom Friedman, which became a column by Tom. And I think that's right. I think President Biden has a better grasp on Israeli politics than either of his predecessors, both Trump as well as President Obama, and understands the power of a quiet word and understated and a kind of diplomatic understatement. I think the idea of sort of reaching for the sanctions box or other forms of kind of ham-fisted persuasion would do more to backfire than produce a good result, because it would force some people in the opposition to have mixed feelings about siding with the Americans against their own government. So I just think that the Biden team is playing its cards well.
What does this mean for the Palestinians and just the idea of a Palestinian state?
Well, the idea of the Palestinian state was at best on ice long before this crisis over judicial reform. You didn't hear much even from the previous government under Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, who are really sort of, well, Bennett is right-leaning, but the coalition he led was sort of center, even somewhat center-left. You didn't hear much about the prospect of a Palestinian state for reasons that are really internal to Palestinian politics. Palestinians are divided between Hamas and Fatah, Hamas in Gaza, of course, and Fatah in the West Bank. President of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, is now in the, 19th year of his elected 4-year term of office. He was born in 1935 or 1936, if memory serves, so he's getting on in years. And it's an open question what happens to the Palestinian Authority going forward. So until the Palestinians, A, get their house in order, and B, make some way toward Israeli needs, like ending the demand for a so-called right of return, I don't think there's much of a prospect. Where there is more hope, Warren, is in the warming of relations between Israel and the Arab world, which you saw with the Abraham Accords signed a little under 3 years ago between Israel and some of its near neighbors in the Arab world. You know, the concept that has kind of governed Israeli-Arab relations for decades is that Israel needs to solve its near problems, namely with the Palestinians, before it can solve the larger issue with the Arab world. What the Abraham Accords has done is sort of turn that on its head so that it's possible to solve the larger problem, the Israeli-Arab conflict, and then through that, potentially solve the smaller but more emotional Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And my hope is that if a circle of trust develops broadly between Israel and its Arab neighbors, the prospect of resolving the Palestinian question becomes much easier. I don't know whether that's going to happen. A lot depends on Saudi Arabia, other Arab states, and of course, a lot depends on the future of Iran. But that, I think, is a better approach than the one that was tried for decades and never worked out.
The security minister of the Netanyahu regime has said there is no such thing as a Palestinian people. How seriously is he taken when he says that? And how much damage does a statement like that do?
Well, I hate to do this. I don't like the term Netanyahu regime. It's a democratically elected government. He won through fair elections.
I stand corrected. Thank you.
I do worry about some of the partners in his coalition. I think, speaking personally, I think some of them are absolutely despicable people with despicable views. None more so than Itamar Ben-Gvir, who once hung a portrait of the murder of the perpetrator of the Hebron massacre in his living room. One of the problems that Israel now has is that Netanyahu used to be able to sit in coalitions with people to his left. Yair Lapid was his finance minister, to take an example. Now, of course, the leader of the opposition. He has so systematically alienated that centrist side of Israeli society that the only friends he has are on the far right. And I think that is doing a lot, not just to dictate Israeli politics, but to really diminish his options. My hope several months ago was that Netanyahu would be able to strike a deal with blue and white, with the centrist forces, and have a government of national unity. That now seems totally impossible.
The United States sends an enormous amount of aid to Israel. Is that threatened, do you think, at this point?
No, but if it were up to me, if I were the prime minister of Israel, not likely to happen, but if I were the prime minister of Israel, I would say, with gratitude to the American people, thank you so much for all the help you've given, and we are no longer in need of your assistance. When I was editor of the Jerusalem Post, the Israeli economy was a $130 billion economy. Today, it's close to a $500 billion economy. It's had some of the most robust economic growth. So those, $3 or $4 billion that the United States provides Israel in military aid, granted, essentially it's aid to Lockheed Martin and Boeing and other U.S. defense contractors, but that aid is a smaller and smaller sliver of Israel's gross domestic product. And I think the best thing that Israel could do is say, we're no longer an infant state that risks being murdered in its crib. We have a large and robust economy. We do not need to be the recipients of billions of aid. It makes no sense economically, and it probably hampers the relationship because it creates a relationship that's more of a patron and its client rather than what it should be, which is a relationship between two proud and sovereign states.
Well, let me ask you, change the subject and ask you a question of a very, very different kind, having to do with one of your columns when you declared that masks, you're smiling, you know what I'm going to ask you. You declared that masks have absolutely no value at all. The value of the masks during the pandemic was approximately zero. What kind of response did you get from that column?
Well, let me correct you because this is important.
I just read from it.
What I said was mask mandates. And there is a large and significant difference between saying masks don't work, which is not what I said,
okay,
and mask mandates don't work, which is what in fact what was the point of my column.
Oh, wait a minute, when you say the most authoritative estimate of the value provided by wearing masks during the pandemic is approximately 0, that kind of sounds like you're saying masks don't work.
Yeah, read the column in its totality. You will see a
Okay.
paragraph right after that, which I
All right.
say
You do talk about the death knell for mask mandates.
mask mandates, and I think that masks appropriately worn, the right masks appropriately and consistently worn, particularly by people who think they are at risk, can work. And so one of the responses to the column somewhat annoyed me because it just seemed to miss the point. A lot of people said, presumably Stevens doesn't want surgeons to wear masks if he's being operated on, right? If my chest cavity is open, no, I don't want a surgeon to be potentially spitting into my chest cavity. I don't want blood from an artery going into his eyeball. So it's a controlled setting for a limited period of time where masks absolutely make sense. There are all kinds of situations where masks make sense. The question you have to ask is, could you sensibly impose effective mask mandates over very large populations over a very extended period of time that would make a meaningful difference in terms of the spread of COVID? And the evidence that not only the evidence I cite, the Cochrane study I cited in that column, but other evidence as well suggests that you can't. And I think a lot of people listening to this would sort of know from a common sense perspective what I'm talking about. For example, when the mask mandates were in place, you could put on a mask, walk into a restaurant, and then you'd order food, take off your mask, and then spend an hour at a restaurant speaking without a mask. Then you would put the mask on to walk out of the restaurant. How effective was that mandate? How effective is a mandate on an airplane where you have to wear a mask, except of course for the 20 or so minutes when you are either drinking your coffee or eating food in what amounts to an aluminum can? So my argument was against the mandates, not the masks themselves. It also mattered a great deal that people should wear appropriate masks. So a mask mandate that makes no distinction between an N95 mask and the cloth masks that lots of people wore, or doesn't particularly enforce whether people are wearing their masks properly or pulling them down over their nose, just isn't going to be very effective. So that was the point of the column. And clearly I failed in some way because I should have been much clearer than I was in emphasizing that I was speaking about the mandates.
What is so objectionable about the mask per se? And what it's a public health issue, and it might be that, maybe it doesn't help everybody. Maybe you can't make an argument on a broad basis that it's really going to do a lot of good. At least you might save some people from getting a disease, which can be fatal.
Absolutely. And I think people who thought that they were at a higher risk should have worn masks and should have been instructed in in being sure that they were wearing the right mask in the right way. But I think a lot of people, I'll give you an example. Because I'm a writer, I have the privilege of working mostly from a computer terminal, mostly at home. Even though I always wore masks when it was expected of me, I always followed the law, right? For me, even at the height of the mask mandates, I had to wear them for a fraction of my time. If you were, say, in a service industry, if you were or are a server at a restaurant, or a person who has some physical work to do and has to wear a mask 9-10 hours a day, it's a very different sensation. I mean, it caused actual physiological problems. There's something called mask mouth. It caused psychological problems for children who couldn't see the faces of their teachers. I'm coughing just speaking to you. So it was not negligible, and it caused mass polarization in this country, which didn't particularly help us. What we really should have been doing is what we did is making sure that everyone got vaccinated and got protected that way, rather than having what amounted to kind of a totem about dealing with a health problem rather than an effective solution.
You mentioned that people who feel that they are at risk ought to be people who wear masks. I'm looking at this study from the World Health Organization that says that half the risk of spreading COVID occurs when infected people feel fine, so they don't know that they have it. And that was one of the arguments for the mandate, which was really in effect more before we had a vaccine than it was when we finally did.
Yeah, no, I understand this, but unfortunately, unless you're wearing the right mask, right, you are more or less deceiving yourself. And I'm not sure if that is helping or hurting the cause of keeping people away from one another. There's an argument to be made, and I haven't seen good data on this, so this is hypothetical. But if people felt they could walk safely into crowded areas wearing a cloth mask, they were probably doing more to expose themselves to large viral loads, to the virus than they were to protect themselves.
Okay, well, let me shift to another subject, and thank you for responding as you did. Closer to home, President Trump was not arrested yesterday. Today, the Manhattan grand jury was told to stay home. Fox News says there's dissension in the district attorney's office. God only knows where Fox News got that one. Chuck Schumer says that he's not sure he has confidence in the district attorney, Alvin Bragg. He says that it's premature to comment on whether he feels good about the DA. So there's a lot of uncertainty. How does that look, if you think, at this point, particularly as we begin a presidential campaign? There is so much at stake for Trump, certainly, and for everybody else as well.
I think it is the height of folly, and I say this as someone who opposed Trump from day one. It is the height of folly to issue the first indictment of a former American president over what is, at least at the moment, a misdemeanor crime, which is falsifying business records. Voters should decide how they feel about Trump, not a prosecutor in New York. And if anyone, I think the only person who is genuinely happy about the prospect of being arrested is Donald Trump. You almost sense the guy is praying for it, jumping for joy at the idea of it, because it will turn him into what he wants to be, the center of attention and a martyr to his people. He's going to force some of his potential rivals within the Republican primary rivals to come to his defense, or at least to oppose what Bragg is doing. It's going to seem like terrible prosecutorial overreach by a progressive prosecutor overseeing a city where otherwise there's a tremendous amount of leniency when it comes to crime. So in every way, I think this is a bad idea. There might be better cases to bring against Trump over efforts to find votes in Georgia, and that seems to me a stronger case. But doing this over what at least now is a misdemeanor that would have to be turned into a felony, I think it's really foolish. And if people, I mean, I think there's a segment of the Democratic Party that thinks that it would be good to have Trump as the Republican nominee next year because he would be easy to beat. But I remember that that's exactly what people thought in 2015 and 2016, and that's not a nightmare we want to wake up to twice.
Well, so if you are a neoconservative, you've said nice things about President Biden on this program, and you've said them elsewhere as well, particularly with regard to assistance to Ukraine. So what if the governor of Florida, Mr. DeSantis, turns out to be the nominee? Is he somebody you could support?
I thought so until he opened his mouth about Ukraine. And I thought his argument about, or his statement that the United States does not have a vital interest in a quote unquote territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia smacked of Neville Chamberlain.
Excuse me, I just got a message that my sound is not doing well. And I realized that I failed to put these things on, and maybe it'll make a difference.
I think,
I hope that improves the sound. Oddly enough, that has something to do with feedback, which I don't fully understand. But okay, so it's not going to be DeSantis then, or might not be. Who do you see who is a potential rival to President Biden, presuming that he does in fact run, that you could support?
I don't know. Probably if Nikki Haley were the candidate, I'd vote for her. Obviously, she's a long shot. I will not support a Republican whose views are lean toward isolationism. I have a lot of objections to some of the Biden administration's domestic agenda, and I have been now for several years politically homeless. But I think the fate of Ukraine is really the most important question of our time, because it dictates so many other questions that are fundamental to the shape of the world. And on this subject, President Biden, although I can fault him tactically on this or that question, President Biden has the big picture right, which is that if we do not stand up to Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, in a case that is as open and shut as this one, it will open the floodgates to a world of chaos. China will see it as a license to take Taiwan. Iran will be emboldened. The rest of NATO will be in a much weaker position, and we're going to be returned right back to the 1930s. Pick your year, whether it's after Czechoslovakia in '38 or some other event from the time that's going to put America in a much more precarious position. America should care about the fate of the free world. We have been the margin between a democratic and relatively civilized world and a world of tyrannies for a long time. And if we don't play that role, the people who will fill the breach will be not, good UN humanitarians. They will be the Chinas and Russias and Irans of the world, and that's an ugly place.
What about the worst case scenario if Vladimir Putin does in fact elect to use nuclear weapons? How risky is that? And I mean, is that risk worth taking?
Well, that risk has always been present since 1949 in the detonation of the first Russian bomb. It is, and it's one that obviously no sensible president can discount. But we run, I would say, not just equal, but much greater risks if we allow the fear of the threat of nuclear weapons to overwhelm our decision making. Putin is perfectly aware that his use of nuclear weapons has to be taken in light of the fact that the West, the United States, and our NATO allies also possess nuclear weapons. And so when you actually game it out, I mean, you can make the argument Vladimir Putin is crazy. He's a rat in a corner. He's potentially likely to do anything. But Volodymyr Zelensky pointed out something interesting. When COVID hit, and Putin was obviously quite nervous about it, he would sit at those enormous tables 20, 30, 40 feet away from his nearest interlocutor. This does not seem to me like a guy who's eager to relinquish his life. So the argument that Putin is likely to use nuclear weapons doesn't strike me as persuasive from that point of view. It's also the case that when you think about his so-called tactical nuclear weapons, those weapons were designed actually by the United States in the 1950s and 60s to stop huge concentrations of Russian armor from overwhelming American forces in places like the Fulda Gap in West Germany. That makes no sense whatsoever in the kind of warfare that's being conducted now in Ukraine. So the United States figured out a long time ago that so-called tactical nukes just don't add a lot of value to the battlefield. And I think the Russians understand that as well. The larger question, though, Warren, is what if we let Ukraine lose by failing to supply it with the munitions and the arms that it needs? What does that mean for, never mind the Ukrainians, what does that mean for a NATO alliance? What does that mean for countries at the margins of Russia? What does that mean for the idea that sovereign borders shouldn't be violated through effectively these fascistic, aggressive, imperialistic means that Russia has used? So we're inviting a whole world of a different kind of chaos if we let the fear of nuclear Russia overwhelm our decision making.
One more question about what goes on in the Kremlin. We really don't know, it seems to me. And Putin obviously isn't the only person involved. Is there concern, or should there be concern about people other than he? And if he appears to be losing somebody in the military, or somebody who's, for one reason or another, not under Putin's direct immediate control, decides to use a nuclear weapon, isn't that a possibility?
Well, yes, and this is, I mean, we're now in a really speculative,
Sure, I
asking
understand.
a hugely speculative question, but an analyst I know who's very astute worries about what he calls the demonopolization of violence in Russia, in Russian society. Max Weber famously said that the state is that entity that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Well, in Russia, you now see that the legitimate use of force exists not only for the state and actors within it, like the FSB, the Secret Service, and the army, but you have the Wagner group, which has obviously been, it's semi-independent, working for Putin, but certainly not for the army. You have Chechens and their militias. And so, yes, I mean, Russia is a huge country and it has a lot of nuclear weapons, and there are real risks. I think those risks exist independently of no matter what happens in Ukraine, because Putin is 70 years old. It's not going to be around forever. He has centralized power in this extraordinary way. So it's a perpetual risk that we've run really since the end of the Cold War, since 1991, when I think the risk was, if anything, greater in the 1990s, when Russia was kind of in a free-for-all place. I don't want to dismiss the risk of either a rogue actor getting a nuclear weapon. That risk has been with us for a long time, or civil war in Russia. That risk is also there. I just think that the other kinds of risks, which is to say, is letting Putin roll through and possess all or parts of Ukraine, are much greater than the risks on the other side.
I have some relevant and important questions from people who are watching. Victor wants to know, what do you think has been the result of the meeting between Vladimir Putin and the leader of China, Mr. Xi?
Well, I was reading their communique earlier this evening. It sounds like something out of the 1930s, the Berlin-Rome Pact, or the pact between Rome, Berlin, and Japan, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It's an ominous sounding document. It's the right answer to your questioner is, I think it's a little too soon to tell. There's an argument that they actually pulled back just a little from this phrase "unlimited friendship" that they had used last year on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine during the Olympics. On the other hand, this sounds like two countries that believe that they have a common Eurasian destiny, that they represent not just the forces, the idea of autocracy against the democratic world, whether it's in Ukraine or in Taiwan or South Korea or elsewhere. And we're looking forward to a world that's shaping up to be actually not altogether dissimilar from the early Cold War, in which a kind of an authoritarian or totalitarian Eurasian center had to be contained in one way or another by a free world at its periphery.
Obviously, one of the concerns we have too, as let's say Stewart points out, is what should the United States role be in the defense of Taiwan?
So I think we have a vital interest in defending Taiwan for a variety of reasons. First of all, we have had a kind of implicit security guarantee for many decades. Second of all, Taiwan, at least for the foreseeable future, its impact on the American economy is enormous. They manufacture a very large percentage of the chips that go into everything that makes modern life possible. They represent a line of defense in what's called the first island chain, which includes, Japan, the Philippines, and we should right now be providing Taiwan with the kinds of munitions that will make Chinese military planners really think twice, really think that in trying to seize Taiwan, it would be like stepping on an urchin or something that could really damage them. What kind of weapons do I mean? The tow missiles, the javelins, the stingers, the handheld, portable, easily distributed devices that would make any kind of amphibious attack extraordinarily costly and maybe even ruinous for China. What's not going to work is if we're going to send them more F-16s or more other types of weaponry that require huge and easily destroyed infrastructure. But we really need to be helping our friends in Taiwan. It's a free society that provides an alternative model to, I think, Chinese people everywhere about what a free China could conceivably be like.
We used to talk about spheres of influence, or we have from time to time in the annals of diplomacy. To what extent is China justified in seeing the United States presence so far from our shores as a threat to their integrity and to their sphere of influence? And are we doing more than we need to in that context?
Well, I think that the United States played an instrumental role in bringing China out of the dark age of Mao Zedong and into the modern world. And all we asked of it is that it play by the rules. Whether it was bringing them into the WTO in, I think, the 1990s. In innumerable ways, we helped the Chinese Communist Party bring their country into the 21st century. So the suggestion that we have diminished Chinese power, at least economic power, is just false. There are hundreds of thousands of leading people in China who have been educated at American universities. Xi Jinping's daughter attended Harvard University. So I think that's a kind of inversion of reality. We did a lot, arguably too much, to help China in the 50 years since President Nixon visited in the early 1970s. What we're doing now is really just a couple of things. Number one, we are insisting on basic rule of law in the international arena. For example, freedom of the seas in the South China Seas, which is important since a very large percentage of the world's commerce goes through the South China Sea. And secondly, the right of our allies, whether it's South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, and so on, to determine their own futures, ideally democratically. So I don't think we are encroaching on a Chinese sphere of influence. I don't believe in the very idea of a sphere of influence. These are countries that want to be free and require American help, especially in terms of security and economic ties, to remain free in the face of an aggressive, dictatorial, and imperialistic power.
Back to the Middle East, Martin wants to know, Israel and Saudi Arabia seem to be on the path toward normalization of relations. Then the Saudi-Iran détente that China brokered occurred. What does that portend?
It's a great question. I wish I knew the answer. I think a lot of Israelis, those I speak to in senior positions, were also scratching their heads about what that détente means. One argument is it's really not an earth-shaking development. Saudi Arabia and Iran have had diplomatic ties that were broken a few years ago. Iran, of course, attacked the Saudi oil facilities, and it doesn't mean, a kind of a new day in Iranian-Saudi relations. The other possibility is that the Saudis are signaling to the United States, hey guys, we have options. We don't necessarily need to have a permanently antagonistic relationship with Tehran. And furthermore, we'd be perfectly happy to have China as the principal outside power rather than the United States. I don't think the Biden administration helped itself early on with a really antagonistic relationship with the Saudis. Of course, that stemmed from the outrageous murder of Khashoggi. That's a serious matter, but there's an argument to be made that we've let that matter cloud the importance of the overall relationship with a country that, like it or not, is a huge player in the region.
Here's Carol, who wants to know what your thoughts are on the dangers of North Korea.
North Korea has been a very dangerous country for a long time, and it's particularly dangerous as it develops both more powerful nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them at greater range. So I'm here north of New York City. I don't think I'm quite in range of North Korean ballistic missiles, but you guys in LA, I don't know where the woman asking the question is in greater danger. Look, North Korea is a problem that multiple administrations have tried to solve. We tried to solve it diplomatically. Didn't particularly work too well for either Clinton or Bush or frankly, not even for Donald Trump, who met with Kim Jong-un. I used to think there was an argument to be made that we could work with China to get rid of the Kim regime and at the same time make permanent the division of the Korean Peninsula. But I don't think that's possible with Xi Jinping. So North Korea is a security challenge we're just going to have to contain, as we have for the last 70 years, until the regime falls or stuff happens.
Here's a question from Lauren. Given the obvious threats you perceive from Russia and China and Iran, what should the U.S. be doing to develop the military-industrial complex?
You know, people say we've never spent more money on defense, and in nominal terms, that's right. In terms of its proportion of our overall gross domestic product, we've rarely spent so little on defense. We're spending about 3% of gross domestic product on defense. When Reagan was president, it was about 6%, and I think when Eisenhower was president, it was in double digits. So I don't want to. I'm not enamored of the military-industrial complex. It's an industry with interests like any other. But we now live in a world in which our strategic competitors aren't regional powers like Iran and Iraq or smaller countries that we could easily defeat. It's China and Russia, countries with huge numbers of nuclear weapons and huge economic capability. And we have to re-engineer our military so that it's up to the challenge of dealing with both threats, or at least deterring both threats in a credible way. You know, one of the things we need is very basic. We need to be able to produce more munitions, not just to give them to the Ukrainians, but to help the Taiwanese to make sure that we ourselves are well stocked. I saw a report somewhere that Great Britain, which spends about, I think it has one of the largest defense expenditures in the world, could not sustain a conflict on the scale of what the Ukrainians are sustaining for more than a week, just because they don't have the munitions they need. So we need to think about the future of war or potential war, not as a kind of a matter of regional conflicts or conflicts of very short duration, but things that look a lot more like the wars of old, which are long-term and involve huge masses of manpower and materiel. So yeah, we need to invest much more heavily in it than we do now.
It's interesting that you should say all that, because there's been so much talk about cyber war and how the next war is going to be cyber war, and we were fighting the last war when you talk about tanks and the kind of ammunition that you're talking about and so on. That seems to be maybe not very understanding of exactly where we're going and or how far we've come.
Well, everyone used to say the future of warfare was cyber warfare, and then Ukraine happened. So it turns out that the biggest war of our time has only a secondary or tertiary component in the cyber domain, and it looks a heck of a lot like World War I. So it means, I think, the bottom line is it means we need to be pretty humble about our confidence about what the future of anything looks like.
Sid wants to know, what happened to the foreign policy of the Republican Party that people like John McCain had? Where do those politicians go?
Unfortunately, John is no longer with us. I knew him, and he was a wonderful man. And the Republican Party increasingly looks like the Republican Party of the 1930s with an isolationist bent. So I really I worry about a conservative party, a major party in the United States, that somehow thinks that if we turn our back on the rest of the world will leave us alone. It's just not the way it works. My grandmother was friendly with Leon Trotsky in the 1930s in Mexico. And Trotsky, a line that's famously attributed to Trotsky was, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that line. We may not want to be interested in war, but the idea that we can just sort of throw up our hands and say this has nothing to do with us just doesn't correspond with the historical record.
You knew John McCain, you said. How did he ever get stuck with Sarah Palin?
Well, I think that was some bad advice that was given to him against his better judgment, which was to put Joe Lieberman on the ticket and have a kind of a bipartisan ticket. I don't think John thought that was his finest hour. And one of the nice things about Senator McCain was he was not at all ashamed to admit his dumb mistakes. In fact, nobody admitted them more quickly or more colorfully than he did. It was a type of politics that you just don't come across so often. This kind of like machine gun candor that he had, and he used to take a few of the writers and reporters he liked on some of his junkets to Europe, where he would take us out to dinner and tell the most incredible stories, which would have dominated a day's worth of headlines. But all of us, it was all off the record, and we kept silent because he was just too good a source. He was too great a storyteller, and he was a person who treated you not as a tool, but as a friend. And it was one of his most endearing qualities.
Well, now that he's gone, are you able to write those stories up or let people know about them? I don't suppose you have
none
the evidence.
None of them are particularly interesting right now because it was usually just high-level Senate gossip from 2012 or 20, whatever the year was. And I didn't take notes. I just remember thinking in the back of my mind, boy, if I could write this up, that would be one heck of a scoop. It was never any kind of news that the public needed to know. It was always John McCain's particularly piquant opinions on some of his colleagues in offices high and low.
Don wants to know, what should be done to Republicans who want to defund support for Ukraine?
Well, nothing. I mean, they should be dissuaded from their point of view. I mean, I don't want to make the suggestion that they need to be punished or ostracized. That's not how politics.
That's the way the question was phrased. That's why I read it that way. So
yeah, no, that's fine. But look, it's not how persuasion works. And what I would say to those Republicans is when a sovereign democratic nation, however imperfect, is fighting for its life on the front lines of one of our principal geopolitical foes, it behooves us to support it. It behooves us to support it not for the sake of the Ukrainians, not because we care exactly where the line is drawn in the Donbass or Crimea eventually with some kind of border, but because if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, it will not stop there. And if you are a conservative and you understand human nature through that particular lens, you know that once the crocodile is fed, it will want to feast again. And it will want to feast again against our NATO allies to whom we are treaty bound to defend with our own troops. So the Ukrainians are blessing us with the fact that they are fighting for themselves. We are giving them the tools, but they are doing the job. The next time we're going to have to fight this war, God forbid, we're going to be the ones who will have to do the job. So this is an investment that is comparatively cheap because it's an investment in American hardware, but it's not at the sacrifice of American lives. That's what I would say to Governor DeSantis and all those other conservatives who suddenly think that this is just a territorial dispute.
Here's Marshash. He wants to know, what are your thoughts on the Lincoln Project?
I don't know enough about the Lincoln Project to say. Look, I don't think I yield to anyone in my views about Donald Trump as being second only to James Buchanan as the worst president in American history, a uniquely dangerous, demagogic, and sinister figure who should never be allowed to come within 100 miles of the White House ever again. But I question the tactics against Trump, not because they're immoral. I question them because I don't think they've been particularly effective. What Trump requires, his oxygen, is attention. And to the extent that we can deprive him of attention, so much the better. I don't know, again, I don't know enough about the Lincoln Project to say whether they have done more to contribute to the attention Trump has gotten than they have to subtract from it. So I don't want to opine and say something that is unfair to them.
What do you have to say about those Republicans who are so fearful of Trump and fearful of being primaried, as they say, that they won't take him on even when he is so unreasonable that they have to know it and clearly do. And we know pretty well that they talk about it in the halls of Congress and elsewhere, but they still don't do anything.
Now, I accuse them not just of cowardice, but of political folly. I mean, notice that in the last election, the midterms, the Republicans who did the most to suck up to Trump really did not do well at all in their general elections. It was Republicans who were, so-called normies. Governor Mike DeWine, for instance, of Ohio, who did extraordinarily well. DeWine won his governor's race by, I think, 26 points.
Yeah.
Whereas the Senate candidate won it by the hillbilly J.D. Vance, won it by 6 points. Brian Kemp in Georgia easily won the governor's race against Stacey Abrams, and Brian Kemp stood up to Trump in the 2020 elections. Whereas the Senate candidates, Warnock defeated his embarrassing challenger, Herschel Walker. So Republicans should say to themselves, actually, the smart play isn't to bend the knee to Donald Trump. The smart play is to say, this guy is not just a clown and a danger, he's also a loser. And if you guys want to defeat Joe Biden in 24, then you've got to be as forcefully opposed to Trump as you are to, the liberal progressive agenda, or whatever it is they would say.
Governor DeSantis has pointed out that he, unlike President Trump or former President Trump, is a winner.
Well, that is an extremely effective argument. And if I had to place a small bet, I would say it's going to carry him to the nomination. Wow,
you really think that?
Well, I've been so wrong about so many things in terms of my political prognostications that I think that, but the most I'm willing to bet on it is maybe a beer and a couple bucks, some undisclosed location.
We have a lot in common, obviously. Thank you so much for being with you. Have anything you'd like to say? We're just about out of time, but do you have a last comment that you would like to make before we have to go away?
Yeah, very briefly. There's a side of my temperament which is a little, maybe, I don't want to say depressive, but I tend to see the darker side of things. But when you think of the United States over the long term, it has found sources of renewal and resilience in places where you least expect it. The 1970s were considered a dark time for the United States, late 1960s too. We emerged from it. We emerged from the Great Depression. We've emerged from other much more severe periods of polarization, strife, democratic recession, and so on. We've come through harder times in the international environment. And why is that? It's because this country has a way of generating new ideas, new enthusiasms, new commitment to freedom, when kind of the Debbie Downers and the pessimists like me won't see it anywhere. Dictatorships are very good at advertising their strengths, and they're very good at hiding their weaknesses. Democracies do just the opposite. We advertise our weaknesses and we hide our strengths even to ourselves. But those strengths are there, and those strengths happen because several thousand people are showing up on a Wednesday evening to talk about the future of the country because people care. So it's the fact that we were able to have this conversation, Warren, with thousands of people participating and being deeply invested in talking about the health and future of democracy that gives me a sense of real optimism that somehow, I don't know how, we're going to be all right.
Bret Stephens, thank you so much on behalf of everybody who is part of this program and all of our listeners and viewers. Great to have you.
It's an honor to be interviewed by you. Thank you so much.
Okay, so next time it's going to be Tuesday, March 28th, when the Atlantic's Ann Applebaum will appear on this program. Madeline Brand is going to interview her once again. That is on Tuesday, March 28th at 5 o'clock because of the holidays that have come up. Thank you all for watching. Have a great night and stay safe.